Difference between front and rear shocks, replacement and shock absorber prices. Every vehicle is designed with either a shock or a strut at each wheel, never both. Your vehicle's suspension cannot be changed to use the other. A shock absorber, also called a damper, is a mechanical device that is designed to absorb and damp shock impulses, by converting kinetic energy of the shock into heat energy which is then dissipated. Basically, shock absorbers function by controlling the movement of springs and suspension. They also keep your tires in contact with the ground every time. The bottom surface of your tires is the only part of your vehicle in contact with the road at rest and even in motion. Before we dive in, quickly subscribe, like, and share for more videos. Difference between front and rear shocks. Most people use shock and strut interchangeably. This is wrong because the front shocks is different from the rear shocks. Though a shock and a strut perform the same basic job on a vehicle, which includes damping the movement of the spring and stopping oscillation and bounce, they are still very different. Note: a front shock cannot be used to replace a rear shock, and a rear shock cannot be used in place of a front shock. The major difference between the front shocks and rear shocks is that the rear shock is a structural part of the vehicle's suspension system where a shock isn't. Also, a rear shock is a vital part of the vehicle's steering system and greatly affects angles of alignment. When should shock absorbers be replaced? Every car is designed with a suspension system that provides dampening of shocks and jarring while driving on road. The suspension also improves the handling of vehicle. There are diverse types of suspension systems, but the most common is a combination of shock absorbers and struts. Shock absorbers are used on both the front and rear wheels for older vehicles. However, modern cars use them mainly on the rear wheels, with strut assemblies on the front. Generally, a shock absorber is expected to last at least 50,000 miles before you have it replaced. However, the determining factor is where you drive and how you drive. Generally, a shock absorber is expected to last at least 50,000 miles before you have it replaced. However, the determining factor is where you drive and how you drive. Signs of a failing shock absorber. When your shock starts to wear, the gas or liquid inside the shock absorber will leak out. It can appear as moisture on the top of the shock absorber or running down the side of the assembly in a liquid-based shock. It's essential to know the signs that specify you have a failing or failed shock. These include: car does not sit level, bumping from the rear suspension, the smallest of bumps or potholes becomes noticeable, having a feeling of loose rear end particularly when going around turns, the rear end bounces more than is normal, shaky ride over rougher roads. Should front and rear shocks be replaced at same time? Front and rear shock absorbers are important parts of the vehicle suspension that absorb shocks from the bumps and potholes, thereby helping your vehicle achieve a smooth and stable ride. A strut is the shock absorber fabricated into one unit with the coil spring. Every car has 4 strut/shock absorbers, with one located at each wheel. It is not really necessary to replace both front and rear shocks if only one is bad. However, it's usually best to replace them in pairs, that is, both front struts and both rear shocks. It takes about 2 to 3 hours to replace a single set of shocks, as does either side's control arms. However, it may take less time for lesser work such as replacing a spring. It may take days for a complete suspension renovation. Steps on how to replace shock absorbers. 1. Buy new shock absorbers. If you aren't certain of what type of shock absorbers you need, consult a local auto parts store or an auto mechanic to buy the right one for your vehicle. 2. Jack your vehicle in a suitable location. To do this, park your car on a level surface and untie the lug nuts on both sides of the front or rear, depending on which you want to replace. Make sure you secure your vehicle with ramps and or jack stands. With the car up, proceed to remove the wheels and locate the shocks. 3. Check the shock mountings, spray with metal cleaner. This is probably the most difficult part in replacing shocks. The old shocks may be greasy with age and road grit, so removing them may be challenging. Check out the mountings to establish if they're loose enough to remove. It's easier to spray some WD-40 or PB Blaster in there and allow it to remain for a few minutes to slacken things up before you proceed. 4. Remove bolts from the shock tower. In most vehicles, the top bolts are located under the fabric in the trunk of the car, meaning you'll have to lift up the lining to get to the shock bolts and remove them with a ratchet and socket. Consult your shop manual for more detailed guidelines concerning the location of the shock tower bolts, but they would be in the trunk. 5. Disconnect the shock from the suspension. To disconnect the shock from the suspension and remove it from the bolt, you can use a socket set or a nut splitter. Apply a solvent if there isn't enough room to control the splitter. You may need to unfasten the knuckle at the top of the brake assembly to get the shock depending on the assembly. You can use the same process to remove the nut positioned at the top and keep the nuts separate so you will know which bolt is for which position. 6. Remove the shocks from the bottom and top bolts. Removing the shock off the bolts can be hard, particularly if the shocks are mounted on rusty studs with a retaining bracket. You have to keep wiggling it around till it comes off. It can be problematic if your piston rod keeps turning with you while trying to loosen the nut. You can use locking pliers on the end of the rod and prevent it from turning with the pliers while untying the nut with a wrench. Avoid misaligning the bolt as this will affect you when trying to reinstall the shock. 7. Fit the new shock back onto the suspension control arm. You may need pressure to tauten the shock as it falls into place, and you might need help from another person to lift the suspension back up, to reinstall the bolts in their right positions. Fasten on the nuts hand tight. 8. If you remove the anti-roll bar while trying to remove the shocks, you can fix or reattach it and screw the bolts back on hand tight. Ensure you replace the shock tower nuts you removed at the start of the process. 9. Before you tighten everything back, recheck the torque specifications in the manual to ensure everything's secure. 10. To replace the other 3 shock absorbers, if necessary, repeat the steps. After this, put the wheels back on and tighten the lug nuts back into position. A shock absorber's price can range from anything from $20 to $80 depending on the car and the brand that sorts for the car. Hope this video was helpful. Please kindly subscribe, like, and share for more videos.